Millions of people visit the Tetons every year. The dramatic mountains climb steeply from the valley. No foothills, no gentle slopes. Just 13,000 feet of raw granite shooting straight up from the valley floor, like nature's own skyscrapers. These are the Tetons, and their story is one of the wildest tales in American conservation history. Long before anyone called these peaks the Tetons, Native American tribes knew this land intimately. For about 11,000 years, groups including the Shoshone, Crow, Blackfeet, and Bannock traveled through Jackson Hole following seasonal hunting patterns. They called the area the place where the rivers meet and considered these towering peaks sacred ground. The Shoshone people used Jackson Hole as a crucial summer hunting ground. They'd follow well-worn trails across mountain passes, pursuing elk, bison, and bighorn sheep. Well, everything changed in the early 1800s when European American mountain men arrived, chasing beaver pelts and, well, adventure. And here's where our story gets perhaps its first taste of controversy. And that story is, for many, a slightly amusing one. Well, the Shoshone people, who are believed to have lived in this area for around 10 to 11,000 years, well, they called the mountain range Tiwinot, which translates literally to many pinnacles. Well, French-Canadian trappers, apparently feeling a little bit homesick and a little bit lonely, well, they looked up at these magnificent peaks and named them Les Trois Tétons, literally, the three breasts. Now, there has been some conjecture as to why these men called the mountains this, but in any event, it was eventually shortened to the Tetons. Famous mountain men like Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger, and David Jackson, yes, Jackson Hole was actually named after David Jackson, turned this valley into a crucial hub of the fur trade. Jackson's Hole, as it was originally called, became a rendezvous point where trappers, traders, and Native Americans would gather each summer for raucous training sessions that would last many weeks. As the fur trade declined, hardy settlers began trickling into Jackson Hole in the 1880s. Now, these weren't your typical homesteaders. The valley's harsh winters, short growing seasons, and isolated location meant that only the toughest pioneers stayed. Families like the Jacksons, no relation to David Jackson, the Wilsons and the Moultons built ranches and tried to make a living from this very unforgiving landscape. They raised cattle, grew hay, and hunted to survive. Many of their original buildings still stand today, like the iconic Mormon Row barns that have become, well, some of the most photographed structures in America. But despite the incredible hardships, these early settlers fell deeply in love with the land. They became essentially unofficial guardians, understanding that Jackson Hole was something special, but needed protection. Now comes one of the more dramatic chapters in Grand Teton's story. That is a tale of secret land purchases, political intrigue, and one of the most controversial conservation efforts in American history. In 1926, a wealthy Easterner named John D. Rockefeller Jr., you've probably heard of the family, well, he visited Jackson Hole with his wife, and they were both stunned by the area's beauty. But he and his wife were equally horrified by the tourist development that they saw creeping into the valley. Hot dog stands, gas stations, and dance halls were sprouting up with no planning or regard for the incredible scenery. Well, Rockefeller hatched an ambitious plan. He would secretly buy up private land in Jackson Hole and eventually donate it to create a larger national park. Working through a company called the Snake River Land Company, Rockefeller's agents quietly purchased ranch after ranch, often paying well above market value. The scheme remained secret for several years, but when locals discovered what was happening, well, all hell broke loose. Ranchers felt betrayed. Local politicians screamed about outside interference. Wyoming's congressional delegation went ballistic, accusing the federal government of a massive land grab conspiracy. The political fight that followed, well, was epic. In 1929, Congress had already established Grand Teton National Park, but it only included the mountains themselves and a few nearby lakes, but not the valley floor where the most spectacular views were had. So, for years, Rockefeller sat on over 30,000 acres of prime Jackson Hole land, waiting for Congress to accept his donation and expand the park. But local opposition was fierce, and Wyoming politicians blocked every attempt at expansion. Finally, in 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt took matters into his own hands. Using the Antiquities Act, he created Jackson Hole National Monument, essentially forcing the park expansion that Congress had refused to approve. The backlash was, well, immediate and intense. Wyoming politicians accused Roosevelt of dictatorship, and some locals threatened armed resistance. Thankfully and fortunately, cooler heads eventually prevailed, and in 1950, Congress finally passed legislation that merged the original Grand Teton National Park with Jackson Hole National Monument, creating the Grand Teton National Park that we know and love today. Today, millions of visitors experience the magic that first captivated Native Americans, mountain men, homesteaders, and a determined philanthropist. Grand Teton National Park preserves not just spectacular scenery, but a complex human story of conflict, compromise, and ultimately the shared love of one of America's most extraordinary landscapes. So the next time you gaze up at those impossible peaks piercing the Wyoming sky, remember, you're looking at more than just mountains. You're seeing the result of thousands of years of human history, countless individual dreams, bitter political battles, and ultimately our collective decision that some places are too precious to lose.